I know you can't believe this is happening. I know you're scared, and I want you to be. I know you're in pain, and I want you to be.
The fear, the pain, they have only just begun.
My husband and I were out of town on vacation. We were staying at this bed and breakfast in Vermont. It was in a pretty rural area, but very beautiful. The place appeared to be very old, with elderly folks managing it. They were so nice and pleasant. We arrived there about 7 o'clock and were starving. The old man that showed us to our honeymoon suite room told us he would make us some supper. We told him he didn't have to, but we didn't fight him too much, since he genuinely seemed like he wanted to, and we really were starving. He made us some red potatoes and chicken fried steak with toast. After eating, we sat with him and his wife and talked. We asked questions about the place and how long they had worked there. They told us they owned the joint. They asked us where we were coming from and what the occasion was. They were so nice. In the middle of our conversation, we noticed a man exit the bathroom down the hall, which was visible from the side of the table we were sitting at, and stomp a few doors down to his room, or what I assumed it was. He seemed troubled, like he was upset, or maybe on drugs. He was making grunting noises. The elderly couple just smiled, and you could tell they felt very uncomfortable, like they were familiar with this man and were just dealing with him. I wanted to ask about him, but I didn't. I felt like I'd be making it worse and making them more uncomfortable. Later that night, my husband and I were in our room, laying in bed talking, when in the room next to ours, we heard a very faint voice say, "Not again." It sounded like a man to me, but my husband said to him it sounded like a woman's voice. Then we heard what sounded like a big piece of furniture being moved around the room. A few hours passed and we were asleep when I was shaken awake by my husband. I was startled, and he said he heard somebody gasp in the room next door and make a noise that sounded like they were in some kind of trouble. He said it was not the room that we heard the noise earlier, but the other side of our room. I told him he should call the front desk or the living room and tell whoever would be working there. He did, but very strangely, nobody picked up the phone. He put some clothes on and went down to the front of the building where we met the elderly couple from before. He was gone for about 10 minutes and then returned and said nobody was down there. He said he walked into the back kitchen around the outside of the house and never saw anyone. I'd say about 20 minutes after he returned to our room, we heard somebody walking in the hallway. They eventually walked up to our room and then stopped. Thankfully, the door was locked because whoever it was tried opening it. My husband yelled out, "Occupied!" in a stern, annoyed voice. The person at the door then continued walking towards the staircase. We eventually went back to sleep and woke up at around 9 a.m. We packed up our stuff and went down to the front expecting to see the elderly couple. But what we found instead was very troubling. We walked into the back kitchen once again, and laying in the sink were white rags that looked like they had blood on them. We continued to look around, and eventually my husband opened a closet and found a mop bucket and inside the bucket was very thick-looking red water. At that point, I freaked out. I knew something was very wrong. We walked around the whole place and never saw anyone again. Eventually, we left some money on the back kitchen counter and a note and left. The rest of our vacation was normal, I guess you could say, but when we hit our next stop, we called the police and told them that they should check out that bed and breakfast. They told us they would, but we never got a call back. We never found out what happened until we got home. A few days after we arrived at our house, police were at our door questioning us about our stay at that bed and breakfast. We were told that the elderly couple were brutally murdered and their bodies were dismembered. The woman was found in the room next to ours, chopped up, and her husband was found in the room on the other side. His body had been dragged to the bathroom and his body had been cut up in the bathtub. I was sick upon hearing this. We had to go take a polygraph test, but our story and willingness to cooperate excluded us from possible suspects. Months passed, and I would often inquire about it and call the police, asking if they had found who did it. Eventually, they had. We learned that the man that was staying at the place, the one that walked out of the bathroom that night, had committed the crimes. We haven't gone on vacation since.
I was a bouncer at a bar years ago. It was a normal Friday night, completely packed. The usual customers were there, and they knew not to get too crazy. At around 11 o'clock, people usually started to get out, and sometimes I would have to break up a fight or two. Tonight was no different, and around midnight, a guy got too touchy and feely with a woman. She didn't like that, and I had to escort him out. The guys I kicked out were always good guys, but just had too much to drink. I would usually see them again, and they would apologize for their behavior. This Friday night, shortly before closing time, a man threw his drink at the bartender and cut his head open. I grabbed the guy and threw him outside. They would normally struggle for a second or two, and then realized that they had no chance of overpowering me. This guy was different. He struggled the whole time, and he was almost able to stack up to me. I could tell he had a violent temperament and was used to fighting. After his ass hits the sidewalk out front, he sits up and says something like he'll be back, or that I would see him later. I can't remember exactly. The bartender was alright, but he did need to go get a few stitches. It was closing time anyway, so we just told everyone that we were wrapping up the place in 20 minutes, and we would appreciate them making their way out. I helped clean up as I always do, and when I was finished, my buddy who worked at the kitchen always left with me out the back door. We were walking down the alley behind the place when two of us noticed that there was somebody behind us. We just kept walking. I turned left down the street where my car was parked. My buddy crossed the street and continued down the alley. I kept turning around to see if the guy would follow me or him, but I didn't see him cross the street or turn the corner that I had. I got to my car and drove 4 miles to my house. I had the following day off, but the day after that I was scheduled to work again. Before I left for work that night, my good friend and the owner of the bar called me and gave me terrible news. My buddy who was walking with me the other night was attacked and stabbed to death in the alley. I couldn't believe it. I told the cops about the jerk in the bar that night, but they never found out who killed him. I don't work at that bar anymore, but I did for another 2 years after the incident. That guy never showed up there again. I feel very strongly that it was him who attacked and killed my buddy that night.
My childhood was filled with terrible and horrifying incidents, one of which takes the cake. My parents split up when I was very young, and I lived with my father We lived in the middle of nowhere, except there were a few people that lived on our street. The street was really long and lonely. We lived towards the end of the street, and in the middle of the street was a woman. I thought she was really weird. She lived in a trailer, and once, when I walked by, she tried to sell me some candy. I was with a neighbor boy, so I didn't feel scared or anything. I told her I didn't have any money for it, and she laughed when I told her that. Like I said, she was really weird. What's even weirder is that my father started dating this woman sometime after we moved in. She never came to our house, but occasionally my father would go to hers. So living on this street was weird in itself. It seemed like weird or bad things would constantly happen. Unusual people would drive down the road and throw parties where they would light a tree on fire with gasoline. It really seemed like everyone living on this street was really weird, except me and my father. I always wondered what my father saw in that weird woman that lived down the street, but was too young to really put it together. One night, shit at my house became a horror movie. I was in my room playing with God knows what when my bedroom light turned off. I got up and opened my door. My bedroom was on the second floor, and I called out for my father. He didn't respond to me. I was confused because we had just eaten dinner together not an hour earlier in the dining room downstairs. I called out again, but heard nothing in return. I went downstairs and outside and saw a police car drive by and stop at our neighbor's house. I stood on the porch and just watched when my father suddenly surprised me from behind. He told me we needed to go inside. When we got back in the house, my father was frantic and telling me we need to hide, that somebody hurt his girlfriend, the weird woman I was talking about, and was coming down the street towards our house. This scared me, and I of course agreed to hide. We went upstairs and into the spare room next to mine. It was dark outside, and all the lights were out. I told him they went out, but he seemed to ignore me. He tried to turn the light on, but it didn't work. He sweared, and then he told me to get down on the ground. He told me he could hear somebody coming up our stairs. I started to tear up and was very frightened now. He told me then that he was going to go confront the person in our house, and he wanted me to stay put. I asked him to stay over and over again, but he insisted. Leaving me crying on the floor, he got up and walked out of the room. It felt like an eternity passed, and I heard nothing. Then, I heard something. I heard the floorboards by my bedroom door creak, as if somebody was standing there. I froze up, terrified. I was too scared to even call for my father, which I desperately wanted to do. Then, I heard the person run down the hall and down the stairs. I remembered that our old house was built in such a way that you could walk around the roof of the second story and enter the bedrooms through the windows. I turned and looked outside and saw only darkness. I decided to open the window and climb out. I moved around the window where I was out of sight and sat there in the dark for a time. After waiting for a few minutes, I finally made the choice to jump down to the first story roof and then jump down again to the ground. I did, but I hurt my ankle in the process. I sat right where I landed, rubbing my ankle, and the scariest thing that has ever happened, somebody standing about 5 feet away started walking in my direction. I looked up to see a figure in the darkness standing there, obviously looking at me. They didn't move. I did, however. I got up and ran up the driveway to the street and over to my neighbor's house. There was a bunch of stuff going on. People were walking around, panicked. The police had come and asked everyone questions. and they told me they had come to our house too, but nobody answered the door. I asked my neighbor to take me to my house to get my father, but they just said no every time I asked. Very late that night, the police came again and dropped a bombshell on me and my neighbor. My father was found in the back pasture and was arrested for murder. He had killed his girlfriend, that weird woman down the street, and was trying to pretend like somebody else was in our house. He was sentenced to 12 to 20 years for second-degree murder, and I've kept in contact with him. I've asked him many times why he left the room I was in that night, why he ran around the house trying to scare me and pretended to be someone else, and he would just always say he didn't know.